So I think it's finally time I do a part 2 to this video of me ranking every division in the UFC from best to worst. I did a video in the past ranking the divisions. That video I think is approaching 1 year now. So I think it's finally time we do an updated version of the rankings in the UFC. There are some divisions who have gotten worse, gotten better, maybe even stayed the same. And all of this is according to my personal opinion. You can flip me on a lot of these divisions. I feel like all of them are very, very close, and you can definitely sway me. You can make an argument for every single division over that division. There's plenty of arguments to be made, and I would definitely listen to all of them. But let's not waste any more time. Let's dive right into these rankings of UFC divisions from best to worst. Now here's my little tacky little tier system rankings, MMA guru style. This is how I'm going to do it. Forgive me for it being a little bit hard to see, but I'm doing my best here. But let's start off with the worst division in the UFC, and I believe that is clearly, and I mean very clearly, heavyweight. I'm dragging it over. The heavyweight division is by far the worst division in the UFC. Outside the top 5, there is literally nobody. You have John Jones, Tom Aspinall, Cyril Gane, maybe even Sergey Pavlovich, Jailton Almeida. And outside of that, there is completely nobody. It's full of fat, obese men who have little to no skill. The division is cooked, man. It's definitely by far the least talent-filled division in the UFC. And when you really dive into the skill level, man, there's not really too much skill in the division, bro. I feel like the majority of these guys are just fat welterweights who just really can't compete in that division, and they move up to heavyweight because they're just obese men. But besides the top 5 and some talented guys, man, there's like rarely ever any good prospects. I know Shamil Gaziev is fighting this weekend, so we'll see how he fares. But outside of that, bro, there's really nothing good about heavyweight besides the champion Tom Aspinall and a few top 5 prospects. A lot of the time, if there is a new prospect, they get rushed into the top 5 very quickly because there's not a ton of depth in the roster at heavyweight. There might be like less than 30 fighters in total at heavyweight. So if you win a couple fights, you're already in the rankings. And it really does seem like there's very few elite prospects that come into the heavyweight division. Whenever we see a new heavyweight that's making this debut, he ends up being pretty garbage for the most part. And by the off chance he ends up being good, then he's rushed to the top of the division, and that's pretty much it. And let's be real here, a lot of the good heavyweights right now are former light heavyweights. I think Jailton Almeida's one, John Jones obviously is one. I think Tom Aspinall did fight at light heavyweight at one point. So, I mean, a lot of these top guys at heavyweight are from a weight class below. So heavyweight firmly sits in my number 8 spot as the worst division in the UFC. We move on to number 7, and that is, I think, light heavyweight. Light heavyweight has had a really rough time recently with their champions. Obviously, we had Jamal Hill vacate that belt. Before that, we had Yuri Prochazka vacate the belt. It just seems like the talent as well at light heavyweight is kind of dipping down. There's only a couple good prospects, like Carlos Oberg is one of them. Maybe Nizhachukwu you can bring in there. Maybe Azmat Mirzakhanov you can put in there. But there's not really any good prospects on the come at light heavyweight right now. And it seems like in terms of skill level as well, this is one of the worst divisions. Obviously, it's a higher weight class. The higher weight classes are going to look more untechnical and unskilled compared to the lighter weight classes. Obviously, Alex Pereira is very good, but when a kickboxing world champion can move up and win your belt, there's probably issues there in terms of your skill level, especially in terms of your grapplers. Jan Blachowicz, he did control Pereira in the first round, but after that, he couldn't really get any more takedowns besides maybe, I think, a couple. But overall, you just see a lot of old men sticking around at the top of light heavyweight. And that tells me that the depth isn't really there. That tells me that the young prospects aren't really that good as well, that the division really isn't able to evolve and move on to the next up-and-coming hungry contender. It just simply isn't a good look when a bunch of old men are sticking around at the top of your division. But we move on up to number 6, and that is Flyweight. Now, Flyweight right now is at a very, very dead spot, like a really tough spot with its top contenders. It should have been Manel Kape to fight Pantoja next, but he couldn't make weight versus Kai Kara France. Brandon Royval and Moreno, like the champion is collectively 5-0 against, I think, number 2 and number 3 in your division. That's no bueno. There really just is Pantoja and nobody else. Like Royval, Moreno, Albazi, I think he pulled out against Moreno. There really isn't a clear number 1 contender for Pantoja to fight next. Now, in terms of skill, Flyweight is the most skilled division in my opinion. I think you have to be extremely technical, extremely fast, extremely good to be good at flyweight. But with that being said, there's really no depth at flyweight anymore. We have a couple good prospects. We have like Joshua Van, I believe Steve Urseg is one as well. Like there's a couple good prospects who are making their way through the division right now, but that's really about it. There's nothing really outside of that. I mean, we have again, Manel Kape is a good prospect. Amir Albazi is a good contender as well. I also forgot about Muhammad Makayev and Tatsuro Taira, but really, there's no depth at flyweight. There's like 30 fighters again in the division. There's not many fighters overall at flyweight. Their fights can be very boring. They can be very stale because they're flyweights. They're very tiny people. There's not too much power in their punches because they have not a ton of muscle to really put somebody out cold like that. And if your chin is very bad at flyweight, it's very, very bad because you shouldn't have a bad chin at flyweight because, again, none of these guys have any power. But what really puts flyweight down for me is the fact that there's not really any good top contender right now, and the depth is very minuscule at best. Moving on to number 5, we have featherweight. Now, featherweight was going to be higher on this list for me. If this was a month ago, I would probably put flyweight at number 2 or number 3, maybe even number 4. But watching Yair Rodriguez versus Brian Ortega lets me know that the division is very, very weak. Yair Rodriguez was ranked number 3, I believe, at featherweight, and he has 0 takedown defense. He is one of the, I think, weakest featherweights on the roster. Brian Ortega is literally a walking punching bag, and these guys are ranked in the top 5 of your division. And honestly, I wouldn't mind you putting it at 4 because there is Topuria. There still is Volk. Volk is still very good. There's also Max Holloway, even though he's fighting Gaethje at 155. So like there still are some very good names at featherweight. But when Yair and Brian Ortega are in your top 5 right now, that lets me know that your division is looking kind of sorry. It's looking pretty iffy. And the next title shot might go to Movsar Evloev. That might force Topuria to sit out for months now. The new prospects at featherweight aren't looking too amazing. There's like Lerone Murphy, Jack Shore. I think Nathaniel Wood's in there as well. Diego Lopez is one as well. But these guys just don't have the most elite prospects you've ever seen or ever heard of. I think featherweight right now is in a very huge down period. But maybe in a couple of months, it might go back to the mean. It might go back to being a top 4 division in the UFC or top 3 division. But just right now, currently making this video, it looks like featherweight is at its weakest point. But we move on to number 4, that being lightweight. Now, lightweight, again, has lost some prospects in the meantime. Like, there isn't really anybody who is too crazy coming up at lightweight right now. Paddy Pimblett's probably the best one. There was the Bonfim brother. Was it Ismail Bonfim? But he lost to Benoit Saint-Denis. BSD is also another good prospect. He's fighting Dustin Poirier. But that just might be about it. I just don't see any good prospects to be excited about a lightweight right now. Maybe in the future that might change, but as of right now, it is one of the, I think, worst divisions in terms of up-and-coming prospects. But again, in terms of talent, skill level, the top 5, the top 10 are all full of very good fighters. The top 15 in general are full of very good fighters. You got Jalen Turner, you got Benoit Saint-Denis, you got Poirier Gaethje, you got Mateus Gamrot, Rafael Fiziev. Like, in terms of skill, lightweight is a very, very good division, and the top 15 in it are very, very good as well. It's just outside of that is where the dip kind of comes from. But having a good top 15 can only carry you so far. You need to have good prospects, entertaining fights as well. And lightweight right now, I think, is also on a down period like featherweight, but not as bad as featherweight. There at least still is a lot of huge names, like massive names at lightweight right now, whereas featherweight, it has Topuria, Volk, Holloway, and that's pretty much it in terms of big names. Now, moving on down again to number 3, we have middleweight. Now, I was really back and forth between middleweight and number 2 or number 3, but middleweight has actually improved a ton in the past 9-10 months, maybe even more than that. There's been a lot of prospects coming up. There's been a lot of good fights, entertaining names. I mean, middleweight has kind of had a resurgence as of late, and I'm pretty much all here for it. I am all in on middleweight right now. Again, there's some very good prospects like Anthony Hernandez, Joe Pyfer. I know he just lost, but he was a good prospect at one point. Kyle Baralho, Bo Nickel as well, Ikram Aliskerov, Nursultan Ruzaboev. Like, there's some very good names. Gregory Rodriguez, Obama, puts on fun fights all the time, always getting KOs, or he's getting KO'd himself. Like, there are some very entertaining names at middleweight, and I think with Israel Adesanya, Chimaev being in there now, DDP, there's some amazing fights on the horizon for middleweight, and I can't wait for it. And overall, middleweight is one of the more exciting divisions right now, with Sean Strickland being in there as well. Like, middleweight is on, I think it's peak right now. I think if lightweight and featherweight are on their down period, middleweight, it's at its peak right now. I am loving every single minute of middleweight right now, but there is one issue, right? If Paul Craig and Roman Dolidze are in your top 15 or one of your top fighters in your division, there's problems. And that's pretty much my cliff notes of why middleweight is at number 3 and not number 2 or number 1, because the talent just isn't really there, right? It's middleweight. Obviously, it's a higher weight class. There's not going to be a ton of talent sitting at middleweight, and that's why Dolidze and Paul Craig are able to comfortably sit in the top 15 at middleweight. So I can't put it any higher because of that reasoning. The talent isn't really that good, but in terms of depth, in terms of excitement, in terms of big name fighters, it is one of the best divisions in the UFC. You could definitely argue it to be number 2 and maybe even number 1 if you want to go that far. Now, moving on to number 2, the second best division in the UFC, I have welterweight. Now, welterweight is actually very underrated. There's so many good names and good fighters at welterweight right now, but what kind of ruins it, I think, is the champion and the top contenders not being the most entertaining. Like, obviously, we watched Edwards versus Covington. That was a snooze fest. Bilal Muhammad's top 3 or top 2, I believe. He's not the most entertaining fighter to watch ever. But if you just take that away and look at welterweight as a whole division, it is one of the best divisions in the UFC. Edwards is good. Shavkat Rakhmonov, Gilbert Burns, Bilal Muhammad, Jack Della Maddalena, Ian Gary. I know we hate Ian Gary, but he's a good fighter. Jeff Neal, Sean Brady, they are good as well. Like, there are some very good, talented fighters at the top of welterweight, as well as there's some good prospects coming up at welterweight as well. Look at Michael Morales for one. Somehow, some way, Nicholas Dalby of all people is having a good comeback in the UFC right now at welterweight. Also, Renat Fakhretdinov is a good prospect. Danny Barlow just made his debut. Oban Elliott just made his debut. They look pretty decent. You can definitely invest in the prospects at welterweight. Now, obviously, you can argue that it can be lower on this list. If you want to put it at 3 or 4, maybe even 5, I wouldn't hate that so much. If you don't enjoy welterweight fights, I don't blame you for putting it lower on the list. Just for me personally, I really enjoy looking at the prospects and the talent level in the top 15 at welterweight. To me personally, it is one of the best divisions in the UFC, and that's why I have it at number 2. Now, moving on to number 1, the best division in the UFC, in my opinion, I believe is Bantamweight. You probably guessed it. It's the only one that's not on the list so far. Bantamweight, to me, is the best division in the UFC. And the reason why it's number 1 for me is because I think it's either number 1 or number 2 in terms of overall skill level. I think when you look at flyweight and look at bantamweight, you can tell that these two divisions, in terms of pure technical skill, are the best in the UFC. And I think what flyweight lacks, which is power, the bantamweight division has that. There's some power punchers like Sean O'Malley for one at bantamweight. Obviously, Cody Garbrandt's a power puncher. Petr Yan has some of the best striking in the UFC. So does Corey Sandhagen. Song Yadong is a very young and talented, I guess, prospect still. Maybe you might consider him a contender now, but he still is a very good fighter at bantamweight. And Henry Cejudo, who is now an older man aging his career, when he's getting kind of flushed out by Merab and all the younger guys at bantamweight, you know for a fact that your division is constantly improving, that the younger fighters are getting better, the next generation is better than the old generation, that overall your division is one of the more elite divisions in terms of bringing in new guys and having a constantly improving division. I think in terms of depth, this is the best division in the UFC. I think it has the most fighters inside of its division. I believe there's nearly 70 fighters on the roster that are active at bantamweight right now. And the prospects are also very, very good. You have Umar Nurmagomedov, you have Song Yadong, if you still consider him a prospect. You have Peyton Talbot, you have Cameron Simon, you have Raul Rosas Jr., you have Kyler Phillips, you have the Basharat brothers. There's so many up-and-coming fighters at bantamweight. You just can't really not put it at number 1 or 2. Like, this is one of the top 3, top 2 best divisions in the UFC, and I think it's by, not a landslide, but I think by a good margin. So in my humble opinion, bantamweight takes the cake as the number 1 best division in the UFC. If you disagree or if you agree, leave a comment down below. Let me know your opinion. Give me your own rankings in the comments down below as well. But that concludes my list. I'll go through it real quick. At number 8, the worst division in the UFC, I have heavyweight, then light heavyweight, then flyweight, then featherweight, then lightweight, then middleweight, then welterweight, and number 1, it being Bantamweight. So with that, I'm out of here, guys. Like, subscribe, hit that bell icon for notifications. I'll see y'all later. Peace.